Hello, everyone, and welcome back once again to Reject Modernity, Embrace Tradition, the show where we take you back to the good old days, just probably not exactly how you expect from our title. My name is Clayton Becker.
And I am Megan Cox.
And we apologize once again for the longer than usual break between our episodes. Once again, it's all Megan's fault because I am a perfect angel who has never done anything wrong. Actually, in this case, it's not Megan's fault. It's the University of California System's fault, in that they have not given her the advance that she requires to get Wi-Fi in her new apartment. She has no money.
This is why we should be so much nicer to transplants, because they have to work really hard to get to the place that they are transplanting to. We didn't cover that in our episode on transplants. Maybe we should have.
Yeah, absolutely. But today, Megan, despite the fact that this episode is coming a week later than we would have appreciated, what are we talking about?
Today, Clayton, we are rejecting mere cancellation and embracing cultural change.
All right, embracing cultural change in lieu of mere cancellation. The cancellation is so mere. This, I think, comes back to, we sort of like surprisingly talked ourselves into the position. Like, we were surprised in the episode as we were talking ourselves into it that like the MeToo movement was like not terribly successful in actually achieving its stated goals, or at least not as successful as we might have hoped at achieving its stated goals.
Exactly. This is something that we worked up when we were recording. Like, you can see in real time us figuring out as we are recording our Reject Dating Apps episode that we did not think that Me Too was successful in its stated aims, which really do seem to be more changing culture around gender dynamics and power dynamics. And one of the things that made that so difficult is you get a bunch of individuals who are maybe facing individual level repercussions, but you didn't necessarily see a cultural change that actually would have made things better for more people going forward. So I wanted to explore that today with our episode here.
Yeah, there's like this idea that we like figured it out in real time, as it were. This is the benefit of having a not totally scripted podcast, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like working through this in real time, that we all sort of legibly understood the people who were being canceled's behavior as wrong. But then we looked at that behavior and said, okay, that needs to have individual repercussions. And then everyone else who was not the people who were getting canceled were like, oh, well, I guess I don't need to adjust my behavior or my cultural expectations, or like only the people who were engaging in the most egregious forms of the behavior that the culture that we live in engenders were the people who faced any repercussions.
And I think we also saw, as we were talking through that a lot of people maybe took the wrong lesson. And so that's another source of difficulty when we are understanding where we want to head as a culture and what we want to understand is acceptable. So and this is why I say mere cancellation. I'm not saying that people shouldn't be canceled. I am saying that cancellation may not be enough to get us where we want to be as a society.
Yeah. With that in mind, I don't think we have any like particularly young listeners or people who didn't live through this time period, but could you walk us through, like, for the purposes of this episode and for like how you understand it in this framework that you've written up, what is cancel culture? What is cancellation exactly?
I mean, it is definitely a word or a concept that filtered out of a subculture into the mainstream. But really fundamentally, what cancel culture seems to be to me is a boycott in service of social justice aims. It is a public disengagement from an individual or a corporation's products or services due to that person's views or that corporation's policies. It's a use of grassroots or consumer power for social change higher up the social ladder. That's my understanding of what cancel culture is really trying to do and what it is.
Mm-hmm. But it doesn't really seem that it achieves the higher level end of that spectrum, right? Like, the individual faces repercussion, and then the lesson that a lot of people take from that is the individual repercussions have happened because the behavior is wrong, but it doesn't actually change the culture that creates the behavior in the people who then face the consequences, right?
Absolutely. And this is, I think people are calling this time period in the 2010s, quote, peak woke,
Peak
unquote.
woke.
Yes. Yeah. The time when you were most likely to be canceled for displaying more conservative views, or racist, sexist, homophobic, etc. type views. But there is now definitely a political valence to the concept of a cancellation.
Mm-hmm.
And that may have always been the case, but it is very clear now that, like, a refusal to drink Bud Light because they did social media collaboration with a trans influencer once somehow is not cancel culture. But deciding not to listen to Kanye or shop at Target because of the views or the policies of either of those entities is cancellation now.
Yeah.
And cancellation is perceived as bad.
Yeah, or getting even more recently, right? Like getting people fired from their jobs because they were insufficiently reverent to Charlie Kirk, right?
Yes.
That's
Yes.
not cancel culture, right? But cancel culture as this construct has this left-wing valence, right?
Yes, exactly. It is a tool of the left, which, again, as we've talked about, like these issues always pop up when it's someone lower on the hierarchical, like our social hierarchy, trying to hold someone higher up that social hierarchy accountable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So what are some examples here of cancel culture not working out? Like
not working, not even succeeding in keeping the individual canceled, perhaps.
Yeah, perhaps.
So, an early one the original cancellation actually might be too early for you, is Mel Gibson. He was a well-known racist anti-Semite long before this, but an audio tape surfaced in the 2000s of him being racist, being anti-Semitic, and saying some really horribly vile stuff to his partner, the mother of his child. He has subsequently been nominated for Academy Awards and Golden Globes for Best Director. This year, he has a film called Flight Risk starring Mark Wahlberg. This guy definitely still works. The only real negative consequence that I've seen anybody cite to his career is he's, quote, no longer a leading man, unquote. He was aging out of that position in film anyway. This is the sort of, you either change to a supporting role or you become a director. That's exactly what he's done. And he was directing before this audio tape was released. So Mel Gibson, it doesn't seem like anything has really necessarily happened to him, despite the very clear verbal harassment he was giving his partner at the time.
Or like the only thing you could say is that, like, well, he was temporarily like dispossessed of this star power, and people wouldn't work with him for a period of time. But now he's sort of like done his penance, as it were, right?
Yeah, exactly. He was in the penalty box for a bit.
Into the fold.
Yeah, exactly. Now, Louis C.K. Multiple women allege that he has masturbated or asked to masturbate in front of them, leading to his cancellation. Again, temporary. His TV show and a distribution deal for his film I Love You, Daddy were both canceled. He apologized and admitted to the allegations. And within 2 years, he was doing stand-up again. He announced a tour, which was canceled due to COVID, but not because of anything that he personally, individually had done. He released a comedy album that won a Grammy. He premiered a new film. He sold out Madison Square Garden, and he has announced another tour and released a debut novel. This dude is still working.
Mm-hmm.
Very, very much still working. Now, maybe contrast that with Kevin Spacey. We haven't heard from Kevin Spacey very much recently because this one is a pretty permanent cancellation. Allegations of sexual misconduct towards minors, beginning when Spacey was 27. At the time these allegations were made, Spacey's name was, these allegations were made much earlier, but when they were made with Spacey's name attached, he apologized for the harm that he had caused and came out as gay because the victim in this case was a 14-year-old boy.
It's Anthony Rapp, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
So after this individual sued Spacey in 2020 for sexual assault, sexual battery, and intentional infliction of emotional distress, the jury did find Spacey not liable, and the plaintiff was required to pay court costs. However, 15 other people subsequently came forward alleging similar abuse, including 8 people involved with House of Cards, the TV show on Netflix that Spacey was starring in at the time. Netflix canceled Spacey's participation in House of Cards. The show continued, but Spacey was fired. They also canceled, he had a biopic of Gore Vidal in the works. And then the entirety of the new film, All the Money in the World, was reshot with Spacey's role recast, with Christopher Plummer in his role about J. Paul Getty. He has never been convicted or found liable for any allegations made, but this man is persona non grata.
Why do we think that this is so different from the other ones?
I really couldn't tell you, and I think that feeds into, I mean, the easiest is that this one, he was gay.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's the thing that's different from Louis C.K. and Mel Gibson. So he didn't lean on his power position at the top of the hierarchy. He somewhat admitted to the allegations, apologized, and came out. And in that situation, the LGBTQ community was really resistant to being used as kind of a shield for the allegations.
I remember when he did that, I was like, okay, what a dodge, right?
Yeah, and that was largely the response from the community. And so he didn't rely on his power position at the top of the hierarchy as a white man. He tried to kind of take a position as a similarly disadvantaged individual, but then the community took the side of his accuser rather than consolidating itself around him, which may have been what he expected.
And I think perhaps as well, there's like as we talk about the political valence of cancellation, like there's no like right-wing group of people who are going to come out and say like, actually, this behavior isn't beyond the pale, right? Like people, he's not able to like transition into as many people who are canceled do into like the right-wing grift machine.
Yes, exactly. Because we see people who don't stay canceled very often are taking that right-wing off-ramp. Gina Carano was fired by Disney for comparing the political climate in 2021 to Nazi Germany. She and Disney just settled a wrongful termination suit, and in the statement announcing the settlement, Disney said it was looking forward to working with her in the future, so she could come back to the TV show she was fired from.
Which is The Mandalorian, for those who aren't familiar exactly with who Gina Carano is.
Yes, yeah, exactly. Roseanne Barr made racist tweets about White House advisor Valerie Jarrett that led to the cancellation of the reboot of Roseanne, with the rest of the cast distancing themselves from her. ABC canceled the reboot, but then created a spin-off in which they killed off her character by opioid overdose.
I didn't know that part.
Yes. She has released a comedy special on Fox Nation in 2023, and she has been completely absorbed into the MAGA cinematic universe.
Yeah, I remember like just very recently, right, when like what's his name, the chair of the FCC, and then Trump was like, "Oh, we can do this the easy way or the hard way. Jimmy Kimmel needs to change his tone, or like otherwise, we might come down on ABC or whatever." And everyone was like, "Oh, well, like, remember when they did that to Roseanne Barr?" It's like they didn't do that to Roseanne Barr. The government wasn't like, "Hey, ABC, we can do this the easy way or the hard way." Literally what the chairman of the FCC said. But as we're talking about, like, absorbed into the MAGA sphere, like used as this like right-wing sort of grift machine of like, oh, like the left did that years ago, right? Like where they canceled Roseanne Barr, and so canceling Jimmy Kimmel is totally fine.
Exactly. You're doing this whataboutism, and kind of creating this false equivalence, because again, like the really important fact is government involvement in the business decisions. It's not just the business decision that ABC is making or whomever. It's that they are making that business decision in response to government threats. So Yeah, she's out there making that argument and counting on people not being sufficiently well versed in the situation to understand the distinction. Additionally, very weirdly, she was involved in the RFK Jr. presidential campaign to the extent that when he released a video explaining what happened with the bear in Central Park, she was the person he was talking to in the video, because I guess they didn't want to do it direct to camera. So anyway,
The more I learn about
she's
this
in
woman,
that.
the more insane things get. But what I'm hearing here is like sort of a through line on this is that the only people who stay like permanently canceled, so to speak, are people who have done things that are like truly egregious, right? Like
I got one more that I looked up that muddies the waters a little bit.
okay.
If you're interested in that, actually, I want to tell two more stories that are like somewhat similar and kind of show that there is a little bit more vagueness or nuance or possibly randomness. So Army Hammer, are you familiar with him? He was in The Man from U.N.C.L.E. and
He was the
Rebecca.
Winklevoss twins in The Social Network.
Yes,
Yes.
yeah. So he played the Lone Ranger in the Lone Ranger reboot with Johnny Depp.
Yeah, which was a bad movie.
Yeah, there's been a lot. He's been in a lot of movies that are kind of, mid-range. Multiple ex-girlfriends allege physical and emotional abuse, with two citing instances that seem to indicate a sexual interest in cannibalism.
I do remember this story. Weird
Right?
shit.
Many people remember this story because of that fact, because that stands out in the brain. He said all sexual physical contact was consensual but admitted to emotional abuse. LAPD investigated, no charges were brought. Gloria Allred, famed attorney, declined to represent one of these accusers after she refused to sign a declaration under penalty of perjury. So we have some indications that maybe the accusers aren't being super truthful. This isn't withstanding the scrutiny required for criminal charges. However, Hammer was dropped from a number of projects. He dropped out of some himself. He's no longer an actor and is apparently selling timeshares in the Caribbean and also podcasting.
Oh, okay. Also podcasting. Good to know
Last refuge of a scoundrel.
Yeah, what company we're in.
Compare that with Jonah Hill, who apparently he sent some messages to an ex-girlfriend that reflect that he was kind of a shitty, controlling boyfriend. This woman was a professional surfer, and Hill told her he was uncomfortable seeing her post pictures of herself in a swimsuit and surfing with other men. Another actress accused him of forcibly kissing her at a party when she was 16 and he was 24. These allegations were both made in 2023. In that same year, Netflix released You People, in which he starred with Eddie Murphy and Julia Louis-Dreyfus, and he's since filmed a directorial debut starring Keanu Reeves and Cameron Diaz. So his career is fine, and as far as I can tell, he really didn't address any of these allegations.
I guess to give an indication of like just how little he has been affected by this, I didn't know any of this stuff until just now. I had no idea that Jonah Hill had any allegations against him at all.
Yeah.
So I think, and I think
yeah.
also as we sort of like go through time here from like the early 2000s with Mel Gibson to, Jonah Hill in 2023, there's like very much a like severity gap, right? Like cancellation seems to be becoming less and less and less effective at actually exacting any sort of consequences against people, even people who very clearly deserve it. And I wonder, like at a certain point, does the nature of cancellation, does its like ostensible reason for existing even work at all in the current political climate, right? Like,
yeah, I think that's a big component of it, is the polarization and the political valence that cancellation has taken on. There is a sense that cancellation is somewhat random amongst like normal people. And I think that Armie Hammer, Jonah Hill dichotomy, that kind of shows you a little bit of that randomness, where really fundamentally what they're both being accused of and what they're both more or less has been shown, either with the text messages with Jonah Hill or with his admitted behavior with Armie Hammer, is emotional abuse of romantic partners. And it's a completely different result and a completely different response. And I think some of that is time. Now you can see that it's just like, if you just shut up, someone will come and it to your rescue, and you don't even have to address it anymore. Versus when it happened to Armie Hammer, there was more of a sense that it needed to be addressed.
I do think with Armie Hammer as well, there's the sensational aspect, at least in the court of public opinion, about the like sexual interest in cannibalism.
Yeah.
I feel as though that might have done. I mean, even if it doesn't like withstand any sort of like legal scrutiny, that may contribute to the fact that people won't hire him anymore, and he's no longer like doing acting.
Okay, but Billy Bob Thornton was wearing a vial of Angelina Jolie's blood and vice versa.
Oh.
People do weird shit.
Yeah, but like people knew that was weird, right? Like people thought that was weird. When we got a trivia question one time, we went to the bar, someone was asking who Angelina Jolie was dating in the early 2000s, and we couldn't remember Billy Bob Thornton's name, and so we put down that gross old white man she was dating.
This was it trivia?
Yes, this was at trivia.
You're right, you guys do need me.
Yeah, this is a inside joke for those of you who are not in our friend group. I've been trying to get Megan to come to the trivia night that we do for months, and unfortunately she's been in Oregon the whole time, and now that she's back in California, she has no excuse. And since she's older than the rest of us, we need someone who remembers the 20th century.
Yeah, that's not the way to entice me.
Anyway, the long story short here is I think we're experiencing this declining gradient of the effects of cancellation. And I also think there's probably something to be said for like outrage fatigue, right? Like, you know, there's this news that comes out about like stuff that used to stay maybe more private, right? About like abuse in relationships or just like not being a particularly good partner, right? Like this stuff was like tabloid fodder, right? And then it became like serious news. But like after a number of years of it, people are like, oh, okay, like another person being like a shitty partner, right? Shitty and controlling partner. Like, great, right? There's like a certain level of fatigue that gets at it, where it's like you can't continue to have the same sort of public outrage over the same behavior over a long period of time, and so it becomes less effective over time.
I think that's very true. And I mean, what are the results of all of this? Some people do stay canceled and never come back. Kevin Spacey, I can't imagine is ever going to come back. His big thing right now is demanding the release of the Epstein files because it's alleged that his name is in it, and he's like, just release it all. I want everyone to see everything. I have nothing to hide anymore. So some people stay canceled and some people come back, and it doesn't seem to have all that much to do with actually how bad their conduct is, or even with how contrite they are. But people aren't saying fewer racist things, fewer anti-Semitic things since we started canceling people. It doesn't seem. People aren't saying fewer Islamophobic things. People aren't saying fewer, like, it doesn't seem that the culture is changing. Subordinates aren't necessarily treated better at work. Romantic partners aren't necessarily treated better. I'm not convinced that cancellation leads to better outcomes for the marginalized people we are trying to get treated better. I don't see the current system being very effective. Do you?
Yeah, I mean, you can hardly like describe it as a system, right? As we said, there's like an element of randomness to it, like stochastic cancellation. Bad behavior isn't always punished. And when it is punished, it's not punished in a way that is like necessarily commensurate with the conduct, right?
The misconduct, yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And so there's if we're looking at it from like a sort of very like modeling sort of political science-y perspective, right? Like the incentive structure doesn't really exist for people to stop engaging in this conduct, because even to the extent that like cancellation has made consequences more likely, it still doesn't like actually change the culture, right? Like it doesn't actually do any of that.
And I think part of the problem there is that social expectations are unclear. It's not clear what's going to get you canceled, and it's not consistent. You don't get canceled every time for the same level of misconduct. It's just like any other sort of almost like criminal justice conversation, where you might argue that the best way to run a system is consistent low level punishment for different for the issues that you want to address. If we make sure that every time someone speeds, they get a ticket, and the consequences are, you do get your license suspended for a month, no matter, you're getting your license suspended every time you speed, people will stop speeding. The current system of when we catch you, great, and maybe there are consequences, maybe there aren't, even if we catch you, that's not disincentivizing speeding at all.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, in the
So,
same way that, and we can think of cancellation, right, as those like, maybe we catch you speeding, maybe we don't, maybe there are
yes,
consequences, maybe there aren't, right?
exactly.
'Cause I think it's one of the challenges here is that so much of like how cancellation works is through the court of public opinion. It doesn't really go through the legal system at all, right? And I think that's sort of one of the reasons why it arose, is because like you have these things that like reach the standard of like you being a shitty person, but in many cases are not like actively illegal, right? And so you have this like desire to have some consequences for that like antisocial behavior, or anti-interpersonal behavior, right? Poor behavior. But at the same time, like you simply can't actually exact those kinds of consequences, kinds of punishments, right? Because the way that people react to like the same story for the same people is sort of stochastic. It's sort of random.
yes.
And it honestly has a lot to do, I think, with like how beloved someone is before, right? There's like people like, perhaps one of the reasons why Jonah Hill doesn't experience the kind of consequences that Armie Hammer did is because Armie Hammer kept putting himself in all of these situations where he was like, I am like a progressive champion of like social justice and will star in the Ruth Bader Ginsburg biopic, right? And like everyone sort of like had this, maybe not everyone, I sort of had this like image of Jonah Hill as like the sort of like weird buddy comedy guy who like,
Yes.
you know,
Kind of a doofus.
yeah, kind of a goofus maloofus who, like, it wouldn't surprise me to hear that he was like a little bit sort of insecure or like a shitty partner, right? And so like even when I hear it, I'm sort of like, okay, well, I don't know exactly how bad that is. I don't know like what all of the allegations are here. And so there's like a degree to which even like as someone who thinks that context, who thinks that kind of behavior is wrong, I sort of don't know like what the like proper punishment is. I think this also speaks to like the at what point have you like served your time for your crimes, as it were, right? Like there's the whole like movement around like getting rid of like the felony checkboxes on like
Ban the box,
job applications, right? This idea that like you've paid your debt to society and you should be like allowed to re-enter society as like a full and participating member. And like there's no like comparable thing for people who are canceled, right? Like we have this idea that like certain beliefs and actions like indicate that you are just like a morally deficient person at your core, and then other beliefs or actions like are things that you can be rehabilitated for and that you should be allowed to re-enter society after having paid your debt, right? And it feels like a solid portion of like why the results of cancellation are so stochastic, why they're so uneven, why there isn't this cultural change, is that we haven't really come to grips with what it looks like to atone for the sins that get you canceled in the first place.
I would add that the randomness of cancellation really feeds into people's overcorrection, where you stop interacting with people who are different from you. Maybe you stop interacting with your LGBTQ colleagues because you're afraid of saying something that's going to get you in trouble, or you stop interacting with your female colleagues or female friends because you're afraid of saying something that's going to get you in trouble. I think that is at least as big of a problem. And it again results from this sense of randomness where we're not talking about what is or is not okay as a society. And instead, we're just punishing people, punishing individuals, and then leaving it up to others in society to try and figure out what was the straw that broke the camel's back with that cancellation. That sort of vagueness is also significantly contributing to our lack of cultural understanding about appropriate standards for interaction.
Yeah, and this has, I think, brought us like back full circle to the way that we started this conversation back in the dating apps episode of like, men not wanting to approach women in public spaces anymore, specifically in like bars and restaurants and things, like places where at one time it was considered fully appropriate, right, to approach someone in those spaces. And so if we want to avoid those negative consequences, but have more effective, like positive consequences and cultural change, then something needs to change from like the current model, so to speak, of cancellation that we are employing through this sort of stochastic framework. Something needs to change there. And we need to think about what it means to actually atone for that behavior and what it means to actually change the culture so that the kinds of behaviors that culture engenders, that culture like brings about. Because it's, a lot of this isn't just like people being naturally born wicked. It's that the culture that we all live in, the general cultural milieu, as it were, creates that behavior in people, right? It makes them think that it's appropriate. It teaches them at a young age that these kinds of things are fine. And we really need to figure that part out if we want to make this like a successful model of holding people accountable and making sure that behavior doesn't continue to victimize people, right? Because that's the real thing that I think we ought to be thinking about is like, how do we make sure that people aren't victimized? Not necessarily like the first order thing that we shouldn't be thinking about is like, how do we like inflict consequences on people when they have engaged in bad behavior? We want to prevent bad behavior in the first place. Yeah.
Absolutely. So I think this is a good point to take a break. And when we come back, we'll talk about how we get to cultural change. Again, why it's important to do that rather than just punish people. But let's take a short break and come right back.
Sounds good. Welcome back, everyone. When we left you a few minutes ago, we were discussing this idea that what we really want to prioritize here is preventing harm in the first place, not just inflicting consequences when the bad behavior has already happened, when people have already been victimized. Obviously, there is a degree to which the punishment should deter the behavior in the first place, but as we went over really in the entire first half, that doesn't seem to be the case. The current model, so to speak, if we can describe it as such, of cancellation doesn't really seem to be creating that incentive structure, that cultural change that actually prevents bad behavior from happening. So in this second half of the episode, Megan and I are going to talk about like why cancellation itself isn't enough, why it's not sufficient, why it hasn't worked, and then why cultural change itself is necessary.
Yeah. So the thing that we see over and over again with these newer stories of attempted cancellations, not even actual cancellations, is that individual level bad actors get to continue doing what they're doing until they're caught. And then they litigate whether or not they've been caught in the right way. This is true of the court of public opinion, where you can argue that your accuser just wants her 15 minutes of fame, just as much as it is true in actual court. I know we discussed in the front half of the episode how usually these are happening in the court of public opinion, but even when they are happening in the actual judiciary system, it's not a guarantee that justice will be served or that individual level bad behavior will be reprimanded. So, yeah, you want to jump in?
Yeah, I think like the other thing that we mentioned in the first half that I think is important to reiterate here is that a lot of this bad behavior does not actually rise to the level of criminality, right? Like, it is a shitty thing to be as a person if you are racist and anti-Semitic, but that's not like actually illegal, right? So you can't like legally punish Mel Gibson for being a racist anti-Semite, right? You can't sort of like legally punish Jonah Hill for like being a controlling boyfriend if his like actions don't rise to the level of like actual abuse, right? And so a lot of this needs to happen necessarily in the court of public opinion rather than in the judicial system, because that's the only place that it can actually happen at all, right? Like there isn't an actual legal argument to be made for some of these cancellations. And that makes it harder to do any sort of like clear consequences, right? Because the consequences are just enacted by society, which is like not a like real thing, so to speak. It's not one thing at least.
It's not unified. Yes.
Yeah.
So it doesn't work in that broader societal context. It also doesn't always work in the judicial system. So I do want to take us through a example of this not working in the judicial context. We should put a trigger warning on the front of the episode as well, but definitely for the next story, trigger warning. This is going to be a story about an alleged sexual assault. In 2018, the World Junior Hockey Championships were held in London, Ontario. You can tell this is a Megan story because it's about hockey.
And it's in Canada.
Yes. This was a huge story around the NHL, honestly, and you'll see why momentarily. So this tournament is held in London, Ontario, and at this tournament, a young woman identified as EM alleged that she was sexually assaulted by members of the Canadian team. This was investigated at the time, no charges were filed, and then after EM sued Hockey Canada for their mishandling of the internal investigation in 2022, she settled, but the criminal case was reopened. Against her will, quite frankly, she did not want this to continue. She did not want this to go to trial, and we're about to see why. 5 hockey players were charged with sexual assault, one being additionally charged with aiding another person to commit the underlying offense. The trial took place this year in 2025. All 5 were found not guilty. The defendant's defense was that the encounter was consensual. There was a bench trial, so no jury. And the judge says she didn't find EM's testimony about what happened to her to be credible, finding she was not coerced nor sufficiently intoxicated to be able to consent. The 5 defendants and other witnesses' testimony was as contradictory as EM's, as you would expect for an event that was 7 years ago. But with the burden on the prosecution, the evidence was found to be insufficient. Now that each of them has been acquitted, all are eligible to return to the NHL. And so that is why it's been a story in the US press, is whether or not these players are going to start playing for their US teams again. So I am bringing this up for a few reasons. The first is to say, like, best case scenario here, the defense is a woman had a sexual encounter she wished she didn't. That's the defense. It's not good either. That's not a good outcome. That's bad. Next, despite having many friends over the years with whom I've spoken pretty explicitly about sex and sexual preferences, I've never met a person who has participated in something like this, and I've never met a woman who said that they would want to. That's not evidence. That's just, it's interesting that this is a thing that happens somehow, and young men seem to believe it's a thing that the involved woman wants to do. Okay. Lastly, players from the Mississauga Steelheads, which is not an NHL team, it is a lower level team. Players from the Mississauga Steelheads are currently under investigation for a sexual assault from 2014 that involved 8 players. Specific players have not been identified, but the victim said she, who was 22 at the time and dating a 19-year-old player on the team, did not come forward at the time because some of the perpetrators were 16 years old. One of the players on the Mississauga roster, who was 16 in 2014, was also a defendant in the London case.
So it's like a pattern of behavior here.
I'm not saying that individual did or did not do anything. I'm just saying their name is on the roster. So if a culture supports misconduct, be it sexual assault, sexual harassment, discrimination on the basis of race, sex, gender identity, whatever, merely removing one person or 13 people, quite frankly, if everyone involved in both of these cases had been convicted, isn't going to fix the problem, do you think?
No, it doesn't seem like it would. I mean, especially given that what we're seeing here, at least in just these 2 cases, right, is, I think, similar actions with a similar result and an uncomfortable burden of proof that's necessary, right, in the legal system, but which for crimes of this type is incredibly hard to prove and demonstrate beyond that reasonable doubt that our legal system requires. I don't actually know what the standard is in Canada. Is it the same? Is it beyond a reasonable doubt?
Yep.
Yeah, like it
I
just
believe so, yes, yeah.
this kind of behavior, right? Both the like more egregious form of it, of like harassment and assault, as well as the kind of behavior that we were talking about earlier, behavior that's just sort of controlling, kind of being shitty, emotional abuse, right? It's incredibly hard to prove that it happened, right? And so at the same time that we're talking about all of these other things, right? The outrage fatigue, the fact that this is relatively random or stochastic in many ways, there's also just going to be a number of people out there in every one of these cases who just don't believe that it happened at all, right? Who believe that the allegations as described didn't occur, right? And so that makes it even harder for this like process of cancellation to actually work and achieve the kinds of cultural change that are necessary to avoid the bad behavior in the first place.
Yeah,
absolutely. So with that in mind, Megan, what are some of the things that perhaps we can do? I know this is like a little bit tricky, right? I mean, that's maybe an understatement, right? But what are some of the things that you think we could do to change the culture? And what does a successful version of cultural change look like in your conception here?
I think that a change in culture gives us a shared understanding of what is and is not okay for those around us. And that reduces the need for cancellation in the first place by reducing the possibility that one of us inadvertently transgresses social norms. But to create that shared understanding, we need to be much more comfortable talking about what we think is and isn't okay. Like that needs to be the first step. We need a kind of set of social rules that are broadly agreed upon. And that does mean having difficult conversations. But we need to be very clear about what is and is not acceptable when we interact with each other.
And I think like in a like super real way that like people are not comfortable having those conversations, right?
Yes.
They're not even really comfortable having those conversations with like really close friends, right? Not to mention just like a broader like, society-wide conversation about these things. I also think that there's something to be said for the fact that or the maybe not the fact, the idea, the supposition that this needs to be like an interpersonal thing, because we've seen that when it's like when it's been tried at a higher level, so to speak, there's this like backlash against it, right? Like I don't know if you remember the Gillette toxic masculinity ad, right? Where like Gillette did an ad where they were basically like they had a bunch of guys who were like, guys, it's time to like stand up to your bros, basically, right? Like one of the instances they had was like a guy who was like, like rubbing his head, like, I'm gonna go talk to that girl over there, and the other guy's like, hey, yo, let's like wait up for a second, right? Hopefully some of our listeners have seen this ad and it don't sound crazy, but basically the idea is that like, you have to have these difficult conversations with your friends. You have to like stand up and tell them like, this is not okay. You have to have the kinds of conversations that we are talking about people needing to have, right? Those difficult conversations. But the fact that it like came as like a PSA basically from the like Gillette razor company,
Best a man can get, yeah.
People were like, what on earth is this? Right? Like there was as we've been mentioning sort of the political valence of all of this, there was like a big reaction from the right wing that's like, oh yeah, okay, just tell all guys that they're misogynistic assholes, right?
Not all guys, but you are telling on yourself if that's your reaction.
You are, absolutely, right? But I think that that's the kind of backlash that we need to find a way to avoid, right?
Yes, yeah.
Like you need to avoid situations or like pronouncements that end up having this kind of backlash effect, right? Where people become more entrenched in the existing beliefs, more entrenched in like the existing way of doing things, more resistant to having these conversations, less concerned, right? Less and less trusting of future allegations of these kinds of beliefs. This is something that I'm thinking a lot about recently because we got the results back on one of the papers that we've been working on, which is like looking for backlash effects and accusations of prejudice. And it seems like they happen in certain situations, like pretty clearly. And I just think that that's dangerous and bad, and we need to be on the lookout for it, right? So
I completely agree. I'm familiar with kind of where you guys are headed with this, if this is the paper that I'm thinking it is. I'm stoked to read it, first of all, but also I think that's just completely true and intuitively, I don't want to say obvious, but if you have conversations with people who are not necessarily social justice oriented, you know that there are certain words or concepts that just shut down a conversation. White dudes do not want to hear about how they're privileged. I say
yeah,
to a
God,
white
Megan,
dude.
how could you possibly say that to me?
I know, because it kind of, not to say the word triggered, but it just generates a whole like, here are all the things that have been difficult for me, when really the concept of privilege is just saying, okay, but you didn't have X, Y, and Z pulling you back in the same way that someone who is not a white man might. Now, I think avoiding kind of those topics and also like creating a safe space, but creating a safe space to like be wrong and make mistakes and not having that instantaneous call out culture that we've talked about before and we've criticized before is definitely a component of this, to make sure that people are comfortable having those difficult conversations with people that they know and trust.
Yeah. And I think, like, to your point of, you know, the conversations around like privilege shutting people down is a good analog for this.
Mm-hmm.
You know, in conversations when I've tried to have this conversation with people who don't understand these terms, right? I've taken to, for example, describing it less as like an active advantage that you get from being a white guy and more like a lack of a disadvantage, right? That you don't have pulling against you, right? You don't have the strictures that society places on you that they place on people who are not in my position in society, right?
Yeah.
And that seems to go over better, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, obviously not entirely sure how long or how deeply people think about this, how much it actually changes their opinion, but I think there's also a degree here to which we need to find the right way to have this conversation with different audiences of people, right? To avoid cueing that defensive reaction, to avoid cueing that backlash.
I think that's definitely true. I do think that we should assume good intentions in others. We shouldn't necessarily assume that people are being ignorant or attempting to be harmful on like the first offense. I think we should also be clear about what behavior we do not appreciate when it is directed at ourselves or at others, and we should be mindful of others. But I'm really open to hearing what others think, so we can develop a shared expectation and understand what others may prefer before we act. And I think that sense of openness is the most important thing, like at the individual level, that we can carry into this process. If we're going to create this sort of collective sense of what is appropriate now, which I do think we've really lost as a society, then we need to be open. We need to honestly put a little less pressure on ourselves to be 100% right 100% of the time, and speak to people where they are, as we've both discussed with these issues of particularly unhelpful concepts.
Yeah, I think there's something in here about like the increasing evangelicalism of American society, both religious evangelicalism and secular evangelicalism. Like there's something in here. This is like a future episode topic or something maybe that we're pulling out here. But I think
because we're not evangelizing for Jesus, we have to evangelize for something.
For something else. What really cued that for me was like your statement about being right all of the time. Right?
Mm-hmm.
Being 100% right all of the time. I think that there is an undercurrent in American society that maybe, I don't know if it actually exists more now, or if it is more apparent because of like mass communications technologies and the internet and like the lack of gatekeeping and all that. But it feels like there is like things are more moralized today. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And so, you have to be like consistently morally pure, and like you can't associate yourself with people who engage in bad behavior. And you have to call out like every instance of bad behavior, even if those instances of bad behavior or like bad opinions or whatever are, not like actually terribly significant. Right. Like, just to give you one example that happened to me recently, just thinking about it, I made a couple of videos about like protest tactics, right? And how I thought that like some of the protest tactics that people use these days are not particularly effective. They like aren't acknowledging that sometimes the targets of the protest are not the people you're protesting, but bystanders who you're trying to convince through the reaction of the people you're protesting, right?
Mm-hmm.
And like I brought up the example of, civil rights protesters in the South going to Selma, not to convince Bull Connor that he should change his ways, but to convince like white liberals
Northern
in the North
liberals.
who were sitting
Yeah.
on the sidelines, right? That like what was happening in the South is something that they needed to like get on board with stopping, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I had people in my comments, I thought this was a pretty good take. I thought this was like a reasonable historical example. I had people in my comments who were like, how dare you invoke the name of the civil rights protesters? Like, were you there? And I was like, were you?
Were you?
Right? Right? But I think this is like just an example of this kind of like moralized discourse that we're doing. And I think that it's nowhere more appropriate to have that kind of moralized discourse than in the type of things where we're talking about cancellation and talking about cultural change. Like, it's very understandable and in many cases completely appropriate to have these sort of moral discussions. But at the same time, if we're thinking about being effective, right? If we're thinking about actually effectuating that cultural change, sometimes that's not the most effective way to do it. And I think to your point about being open, that requires understanding that like our moral frameworks, like, are not everyone else's moral frameworks. And that especially in conversation, right? When we're trying to come to this sort of shared understanding, we need to allow, at least for like argument's sake, at least for discussion's sake, those moral frameworks to be a little bit less rigid, because we have to understand that other people aren't coming at the same issues from the same position that we have, because not everyone has our individual life experiences.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I agree with that. I think that even if we don't agree with the moral frameworks of others, even if we take some significant objections to their moral frameworks, I think coming at a conversation about shared expectations of behavior from a position of openness is more likely to get more people on board as a more cohesive society with what we expect from each other. I think that's the most important thing. And I think it will reduce harm in the long term if that's what we do.
I think to this point about shared expectations, there's a degree to which this is both, yes, like society-wide expectations of appropriate behavior, but then also like individual and partner level shared expectations of appropriate behavior, right? Certain things that certain partners will be okay with, right, in a relationship, or that certain boundaries that they have, right, are going to differ from partner to partner that many people will have over the course of their lives, right? Like, I obviously am a bad example of this, right? Having like married the person I was dating in high school. But, like, Megan, I'm sure that you've had like different relationships, and different people you've been in relationships with have had different expectations and different boundaries. And I think it's important to be open and honest with each other at the very beginning of that, like at the beginning of a new relationship, like what those boundaries are, right? And if someone else's boundaries are not the boundaries you're comfortable with, then, like, you either need to come to an agreement on whose boundaries are going to change, or maybe that relationship just isn't right for you two, right? Like, there's a degree here to which, like, let's just use say the only thing that Jonah Hill was accused of was being uncomfortable with his partner posting pictures in a swimsuit and surfing with other guys, right? He's allowed to want those boundaries, right? It's up to his partner to be like, am I comfortable with those boundaries? And if you're not comfortable with those boundaries, then that's just not the right relationship for you.
Yeah, and that was largely the discourse around this. It was also something else that we've talked about doing an episode on, kind of the use of therapy speak, in a way that was really kind of designed to control another person. Those aren't boundaries. Telling somebody else to do something is not a boundary.
Boundaries, yeah. And so it's like, it's you're allowed to want to have those boundaries, right? But your partner has to agree that those boundaries are something that like you agree upon in your relationship, right? Yeah, I think there's probably not that much more for us to say on this. I think this is probably a good place to end this particular episode.
Mhm.
I think we have like there's future episodes to do about therapy speak and about this evangelicalism.
Yes.
But for now, we'll call it here. I don't think we have the sort of until we do all these things. We don't really
No.
have that action item yet for this one.
Until we get to a point where we as a society can have open conversations about our expectations of each other. I have been Megan Cox.
And I have been Clayton Becker. And we'll keep thinking about this. And see you guys on some ones in the future.